Hi everyone, welcome to our first or second full week of the Cold War and this strange new thing that we're doing called distance learning. Before I jump into the lecture, I want to take a second to kind of show you some things on Google Classroom in case you're missing them. So I'm in your classroom section, and this is all of the things that have been posted so far for the Cold War. So by now you should have already turned this in, but you can see your week 1 journal entries are right here. And then all of the videos that I've posted, again, by the time you're looking at this, hopefully there are some more that I've posted right here. Week 2 journal entries, which you should be starting to look at right now. And then your Cold War assessment. You will only see one of these on your Google Classroom. But let's go ahead and look at what you are going to do. So this is the assessment that you are doing for the Cold War. Let me go ahead and open it. And it makes a copy for you, right? And then there's 4 parts to this thing, okay? So it says you're going to answer these questions and submit it by 11:59 on Sunday, May 3rd. You may write your answers. I anticipate it will be about a page or 2, or you can be more creative. You may record your answers, sing your answers, draw, paint your answers, if that's where your skills are, etc. This should be like if you are in advanced art or that's where you spend a lot of your time and your energy. No stick figures for me, okay? And if you have a different idea about how you want to convey your answers, let's chat. If you have a more creative way you want to do this, let's see what we can make happen. All right, so remember it's due May 3rd. Reach out to me if you need something or later if you don't like your first score. All right, so the first part, what is the Cold War? What's America's overall goal? You might also think about, is there a difference between what America's stated goal is versus her actual goal? So you might say, America says it's fighting communism, but in reality, it's doing something else. Or it's trying to do something else. Part 2, you're going to explain one domestic element of the Cold War. So domestic is something that happened within the United States, right? Not outside. So you want to talk about a war or something like that, but something that happened within the United States. Did this element help America reach its goal, which we talked about in part 1? And then overall, give the United States a grade for this part of the Cold War. And that can be a letter grade, but make sure you explain why you gave them that grade. Okay? Part 3, you're going to essentially repeat that, except you're going to do it for a foreign element of the Cold War. So something that the United States did outside the country. So this is where you would talk about a war or something like that. Okay? Again, you're going to answer, did this element help America reach its goal? And overall, overall, you're going to grade the United States on this element of the Cold War as well. All right, the last part, you have options. You need to do one of these. Okay, option A, what's the legacy of the Cold War? What are the long-term consequences of America's actions at this time? Maybe for the United States, maybe for the world. Maybe you talk about what are the long-term consequences for a place like South Korea or Vietnam or something of that nature. And then option 2, what are the similarities or differences between how the United States responded to perceived threats in the Cold War versus our response to COVID-19 or the coronavirus? If we think about that these are worldwide fears or things that the United States is afraid of, how might you compare our response to these things, whether we're talking about the perceived threat of communism or the Soviet Union versus the coronavirus? So that is your Cold War assessment. And I actually am going to point out one more thing before we get into our lecture. Let me go back to your journals for just a second. So remember, I am going to do the first 3 for you. I'm going to give you those questions. And then these 2 down here are up to you to kind of figure out what you want to do. I've seen a couple of them that you've turned in so far, and not a lot of detail. This isn't something like that I want you to just all do at one point. Like, it's set up so that you could do about 1 a day and then turn it in. Much like we did our energizers when we were together. The reason I want to point this out is I really want you to take this part serious, maybe even more so than this. And I'm going to show you guys something. So I've asked you to kind of journal your experience in this time, in this pandemic that you're living through, because we are making history. And I want you to remember what it felt like to live through this. So I'm doing one myself. So this is one that I've been writing in about my experience in the pandemic and being stuck at home. So I have this one. I don't do it so often anymore, but I used to do it a lot more. This journal is something that a friend gave me right before I was going to be an exchange student in Taiwan. So this whole journal is about my experience. It's not something that I read every day, but if my house was burning down, this is one of the things that I would grab because my experience and what I thought at that time, I think is pretty important to who I became as a person. And so I would want that. Let's see, this one, it's not finished. I think this one right here is from my husband's time in Afghanistan. And so it too is, it's not going to be all happy things. It's going to be a lot of sad things or stressful things in here. But I want to remember what I felt like from that experience. So I want you to take these serious. I want you to really think about, what are you experiencing and what would you want yourself or people to remember in the future about what it meant to live through this time. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the Cold War. All right, so this is our 6th lecture on the Cold War. All right. So when we left off, I was talking about the CIA and the CIA's involvement in lots of different countries. So we're going to take a step back and then I'll kind of connect these things in just a second. So one of the things that we see in the post-World War II era is the creation of Israel. So Britain had controlled Palestine, which would become Israel in a second, after World War I. Shortly after World War II, they are going to call for Palestine to be partitioned or separated between Arabs and Jews. Okay, so creating a Jewish state of Israel in 1948. For many in the world, this is pretty controversial, but it makes a lot of sense why there would be some support for this after World War II. So thinking of creating a Jewish state, particularly in light of the Holocaust. So despite some resistance from people in the United States, Truman, as the United States, is going to immediately recognize Israel. However, many in that area are not happy about this. And so we're actually going to see within 6 months a war break out. And Israel will actually win that war in just the early stages of being a nation. This is still a major, major issue. And one of the fights is over Jerusalem. It's significant to both the Jewish and the Muslim faith, and both would like control or influence over this area. We historically, as a nation, have typically sided with Israel. That has not made us lots of friends in the Middle East, and it has complicated our relationship in the Middle East. The other thing is Palestine, which originally was under, or not originally, but in the 1940s was under British control and then was broken up into Israel and then Palestine. Palestine itself is not officially recognized by all countries in the world as an official nation or an official place. The United States does not recognize Palestine. And that's a problem because one of our human rights is that you have the right to nationhood or the recognition of that. And so this makes this a really complicated thing. This has gotten even more complicated under the Trump administration. And one of the things that we saw was the United States moved its embassy or is planning to move its embassy to Jerusalem. And it had not been there before. And so this is really increasing the amount of tension in this area, particularly around the United States' relationship to these places. We've seen lots of tension rise, whether it's violence or growth of settlements. Also, the leader of Israel, Netanyahu, is under investigation for corruption. And so even within Israel, the people of Israel are having some questions about what's going on. So this is a very, very complex issue. I'll show you a picture just to show you. So this was from this weekend, and today is April 20th. And you can see this is a protest in Israel at this moment, this weekend. And they are protesting the corruption, and what they see is Netanyahu's overreach and corruption, but also limiting democracy in their nation. And so this is a protest, and if you can tell, they've spaced themselves out. So even though they're protesting, they have kept themselves 6 feet away in recognition of the pandemic that we're in and the need to stay away from people. But feeling that issues are so important that even in this dire situation, it is important for them to show force and to show how unhappy they are under Netanyahu's leadership. All right. However, if we go back to where we are historically, even after Israel wins that first war, there's going to be continued conflict between the Arab world and the Jewish world of Israel. And you're going to see that kind of get a little bit tenser under or when Nasser comes to power in Egypt in 1954. Nasser comes to power in Egypt, and he has this goal of uniting the Arab world. And he, in that goal, or to reach that goal, he's willing to work with the Soviet Union. And that doesn't mean that Nasser is communist. It just means that he recognizes that the Soviet Union would be willing to help them. And he's thinking about his goals, and he's going to reach them however he's going to reach them. Obviously, does not make the United States very happy. And so they're going to withdraw financial support from a dam project that we were helping with. So Nasser's going to seize control of the Suez Canal. And much like in Chile or Iran or Guatemala, you see that this leader that's coming to power wants to nationalize or take this resource and put it under their own control. And so for Egypt, one of their major sources of revenue or things is the canal. And so he wants to take control of that. This is going to be a problem for 2 reasons. Number one, it's a British company that owns the canal or is operating the canal, and that's how Europe is getting their oil. It's also going to block Israel's access to the Red Sea. And so for those reasons, you're going to see that Israel is going to team up with Great Britain, France, and they are going to attack Egypt, essentially. The Soviet Union will threaten to join on Egypt's side. This is going to put Eisenhower in a tough spot. What do we do? How do we make sure that this doesn't erupt into a world war? And so what Eisenhower does is he tells everybody to go home. Israel, Great Britain, France, go home. Get out of here. So it's going to show the U.S.'s leadership over these European nations, these Western nations, and it's going to lead what is known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. So essentially, it's the United States' right to help in the Middle East to resist communist aggression. So we can get involved if we think that there is a threat of communism or there is communist aggression that is growing in that area. We have the right to step in, which is not the United States going to the Middle East and be like, hey guys, you want our help? But it's us saying that that is where our interests are. And so we're going to do that. And we're going to use that justification to get involved in other places like Lebanon. The other really interesting thing is that in Chile or Guatemala or Iran, all of those countries, all of those leaders get removed in the coup. But Nasser not only gets to stay, so we don't use the CIA, we don't go in and remove him. Not only does he get to stay as leader, but Egypt also gets to keep the canal. So this one is different than some of the other places that we talked about. All right, then we get this guy right here, or this election. So the president that's going to come after Eisenhower is going to be Kennedy. And Kennedy in 1960 is running against Nixon. And so for many, Kennedy is this young, handsome, wealthy, Ivy-educated man versus Nixon, who is the common man. He kind of made something of himself rather than inheriting wealth and prestige. He's also connected to the older administration, to the Eisenhower administration. And typically you talk about that in this 1960 election, the thing that really helped Kennedy win was this TV debate. And that's what this is a picture from. That Kennedy did so much better on this TV debate. He was tan and relaxed, and he just did so good. Nixon had just come out of the hospital. He'd lost 20 pounds. Didn't look good. But it's actually more complicated than that. And to sort of start talking about why it's complicated, I'm going to go ahead and show you this jingle. So this was Kennedy's political ad from his election.
man for president who's seasoned through and through. But that's a doggone season that he won't try something new. A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do.
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. But it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy. Do you want a man with spirit who is not afraid to fight?
A man whose record shows that he will fight for what is right.
A loyal man who brings the...
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. See if I can figure this out. Okay. All right, so we see this ad, and you probably didn't recognize his voice, but you actually have Frank Sinatra that is doing that jingle, which is really showing that Kennedy is kind of getting in touch with pop culture at that time as well to try and help him win. The one thing that Kennedy has or is that is making people question him is he's Catholic. And this is a moment in time where people are suspicious or have questions about whether that would make him a good leader, whether he would be more loyal to the Pope rather than the United States. And so he has to do some work to try and convince people that his loyalty is to the country and not to his religion. But if we look at this election map right here, what we see is the popular vote is actually really close. It's about 100,000 people different. And the electoral vote is much wider than that. But this right here has people questioning some things that happen, particularly in the state of Illinois, and some funny things that happen in that state, whether there was some voter fraud or things happening. But I'm going to argue that it's not voter fraud that helps Kennedy, even though there probably was a little bit there. It's not this TV debate. It might have something to do with Sinatra, but it's actually these two things. So number one, this guy right here is LBJ, which I will talk about more in a little bit, but he is my favorite president. He's a very complex, interesting man, but he's my favorite. And he's from Texas. JFK, I mentioned, is wealthy. He went to Ivy Leagues, all these sort of things. He's from New England. And so he is a New England or Northern Democrat. And he's going to have a hard time kind of convincing the Southern Democrats to get behind him. But putting LBJ, who's from Texas, on his ticket is going to help him win some of those states. And so that's going to be an important thing for Kennedy to kind of bridge the gap between those kinds of Democrats. We're going to see later, particularly in the next unit, this is going to complicate things because LBJ is not really the politician that the South bargained for, but we'll get there. But the other thing, maybe even more important for the election itself, is going to be this thing right here. And so it says this is a blue bomb. Not literally a bomb, I'm not blowing anything up, but it's these papers right here, or these pamphlets that are printed on blue paper. So this is the early days of the civil rights movement. And during the election, Martin Luther King is actually arrested and he is in jail. Prior to that, Martin Luther King Jr.'s dad, so senior, was going to vote for Nixon. However, when King is arrested, the Kennedy administration says, we have an opportunity here. What can we do about this? And so they make some decisions. Number one, JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, who is a lawyer and will become Attorney General, is going to call the King family and behind the scenes is going to work to kind of get King out of jail. JFK is going to call Coretta Scott King, so King's wife, and talk to her. And so those actions, they're going to start running these pamphlets. Look, Kennedy cares about African Americans. Look at what Kennedy is willing to do. He understands your plight. Nixon is not doing anything. So he's trying to differentiate between the two candidates. But these blue pamphlets are only distributed in African American communities, only distributed in African American churches. So it's an early example of targeted advertising. So these are going to go in some communities and not in others. He's not going to release these in white communities in the South or in other parts of the country where this wouldn't help him. But he is using a strategy to try and get African Americans to vote for him. And I would argue that it's that push and getting African Americans to support him that will kind of help push him over the edge and win this election. All right. The Kennedy family is very new, one of the youngest presidents we've ever had. He and his family are going to bring a much different flavor into the White House. I'm going to move myself so you can see those guys. So he's very young, I mentioned. His wife is very young, very pretty. They have children in the White House. This is JFK Jr. He was actually born just weeks after the president won the election. And so you have young kids in the White House. They look, again, young and beautiful. Jackie Kennedy is bringing all this culture and this art to the White House. So people adore them. They love the Kennedy family. Maybe they don't like his politics, but they want to be like them. However, this is more of an image than a reality. Number one, Jackie Kennedy is actually going to lose a baby in the White House. Actually, just months before, 2 months, 3 months before JFK himself is assassinated, she will lose a baby. The other thing is JFK is very attractive. He's also a womanizer. So he is having all sorts of affairs, even while he's in the White House. And so a rocky relationship between the two of them. He also looks young and healthy and vibrant. Beneath the surface, he has all sorts of health issues that we'll kind of get into in a little bit. However, each First Lady, or we compare each First Lady to Jackie Kennedy. And so you can see she's very stylish. You might hear something about Jackie O style or Jackie O glasses. And so we compare our First Ladies not only for their style, but their actions. And so you can see this is Melania Trump, I believe, at the inauguration, and she is trying to essentially emulate that style that we see from Jackie Kennedy. Difference between them, Jackie Kennedy is going to be a very active First Lady. You're going to see her a lot, whereas Melania Trump is definitely not an active First Lady. They're just different. You could think back to Michelle Obama, a much more of an activist or an active First Lady than we have right now. All right, but almost immediately, you're going to see that Kennedy is going to have some major things that he is going to need to deal with. So the first sort of crisis he has to deal with is known as the Bay of Pigs. And this has to do with Cuba. So in Cuba, you're going to see the rise of Fidel Castro. He had overthrown the U.S.-backed dictator, so the person that the United States thought that they could work with. And that is going to very much anger Eisenhower. This is the end of Eisenhower's time in office. So his response to that is going to be to cut off all economic and diplomatic ties, something that essentially exists to this day. Okay? And then the CIA is going to start a plan to try and overthrow Castro, much like they did in other countries. So again, those places that we have mentioned, particularly Iran and Guatemala at this time. If you want to do some digging into the CIA's attempts to assassinate Castro, there are all sorts of crazy, crazy ideas that the CIA came up with about how they could get rid of Castro, but they're never successful. He lives until his 90s or something like that. But Eisenhower's going to leave, and then JFK is going to take over. He's going to be inaugurated and come to power. So he does not like the CIA plan, but they promise him that it will work, and he is really concerned about looking weak on communism. So he thinks that if he's able to, very early on in his career, get rid of Castro and this goes off, everything's going to be great. This is going to be really good for him. But it's a massive failure. Number one, prior to the action or the plan, the New York Times is going to print it on the front page of the newspaper. That's not good. So what should have been an aerial strike, not going to go over well. So then they're going to focus more on a land invasion. Okay, so U.S. trained, CIA trained members that are going to try and overthrow Castro. Land invasion. Absolute failure. Castro is prepared. He knows they're coming. And so they're essentially waiting on the beach for these guys. And they're going to capture all of these men. However, ultimately the United States will arrange for a trade. So we're going to trade. We're going to get those prisoners out. And we're going to give the Castro regime $52 million in food and medical supplies. I want to point this out because it's an absolute failure on the U.S.'s part, particularly because it's going to strengthen the Cuba's ties to the Soviet Union. But it's also highlighting a failure of the Castro regime or the earliest days of communism under Castro, because $52 million in food and medical supplies. if that's what your country needs, that means things are not going well. And so this is a sign that perhaps there are some major flaws in what's happening in Cuba. The other thing I want to point out about Castro is he's known to have said that I'll be a communist if I can be Stalin. So he wasn't necessarily a communist when he was rising to power or when he was talking about overthrowing Batista. He's more concerned about getting power. And so it's not just about the doctrine or the ideology of communism or whatever. For Castro, it's whatever is going to help him gain and maintain power. All right, but from that one crisis, Kennedy's going to move to another crisis, this one in Europe. And so one of the reasons that JFK is not going to do more in Cuba, we're not going to send in troops or anything like that, is he's worried about Khrushchev retaliating. So again, the leader of the Soviet Union. However, JFK hesitating is going to be seen as weakness to the Soviet Union. And so in return, Khrushchev is going to essentially try and bully Kennedy into recognizing or accepting East Berlin and East Germany as independent locations, as well as essentially trying to kick the United States out of West Berlin. So essentially getting the United States out of what the Soviets view as their sphere and their area. Kennedy is not going to give into those things, but he's definitely going to feel the pressure of Khrushchev, and I think he pretty quickly sees that he might have been a little bit overconfident in his ability to work with Khrushchev. This picture right here is a speech that he gave in Berlin, a pretty famous speech. There's this famous quote about him saying in German that I'm a Berliner, like I'm here with you guys, I understand, I stand in solidarity with you guys. One of the things that is happening is this is when the Berlin Wall goes up. And the Berlin Wall goes up to essentially isolate West Berlin. But the other thing it's doing is trying to prevent people from the Soviet sphere in either East Berlin or East Germany from getting to the more relaxed, more open West Berlin. So what this is actually showing is a failure of communism, or the way that it is being practiced in Europe. Because if you have to build walls to prevent people from fleeing or trying to escape, that means the situation in that area or under your control is pretty horrific if people are trying to escape and are willing to do that in order to flee communism. However, what Kennedy does is he doesn't demand anybody tear down on a wall or send in troops or anything like that. He essentially says, a wall is a lot better than a war. So this isn't great. We don't love this, but I'm not willing to start World War III. I'm not willing to send in troops to stop this from happening. All right, so what we're going to see is this relationship back to Cuba between Castro and Khrushchev. That's going to get closer. We're going to be working much more together after the Bay of Pigs. And that's going to have pretty severe consequences. So what we see, and this is a very young Castro, and then this is Khrushchev. So Khrushchev is going to convince Castro to allow the Soviet Union to put in SAM, so surface-to-air missiles. That are going to be built in Cuba, but controlled by the Soviet Union. The United States is going to see these when a spy plane flies over Cuba and can see them. The Soviet Union is going to be like, oh, don't worry about them. They're defensive missiles, no big deal. It's the same as your missiles in Turkey that are directed at us. Everything is fine. But also don't attack us because that means war. So we have this information. But then in October, another flyover by a U.S. spy plane is going to show that the Soviet Union lied. That they're really offensive, not defensive missiles. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I'm not really sure what the difference between an offensive and a defensive missile is because they both are terribly destructive. But whatever the difference is, it's a really big deal. The other thing is, again, Kennedy wants to make sure he looks very tough on communism. So he's got to figure out essentially how do you get yourself out of this very tight situation. The other thing is, he doesn't want to go to nuclear war. Nobody actually wants to go to a nuclear war. So how do we kind of get out of this mess? All right, just to show you, these are the two sets of missiles that they're talking about. So the U.S. has missiles in Turkey that are directed at Russia, and this is essentially their range, how far those missiles can travel. And so this is where the missiles are being put in Cuba, and you can see this circle is how far they could reach. And there's some talk that they could even potentially hit places like DC. So it's a really big deal that these missiles are going in there. All right, So these are essentially what JFK's options were. He could do nothing. He could open diplomatic discussions. He could quarantine Cuba. He could give the Soviets and the Cubans 24 hours to remove the missiles and then do something. Or he could launch a surprise attack. So I might ask you to pause, or I might have you think about pausing and thinking about what would be the strengths and the weaknesses of these different options. And then what would you do? What do you think would be in the United States' best interest? All right, one of the other things that you could do is watch what is known as, or this movie called 13 Days. It's a pretty good one. It's not 100% historical, but really showing you what a tough, tense moment this was in the United States. And it's called 13 Days because that's how long essentially the crisis lasts. Okay. So it's the 13 days in October from when they essentially find these offensive missiles to when the crisis is over. So what we're going to see the administration do is form what's known as ExComm. So ExComm is a group of Kennedy's advisors. They're going to meet essentially in private, and Kennedy's going to keep going about his day. And he's just going to try and appear normal, and he's going to let ExComm do his thing. And the reason for that is this is prior to Kennedy wanting to tell the Americans what's happening. Kind of wants to have a game plan before he scares the living daylights out of everybody. So he lets them meet, and then he will meet up with them, and they'll make some decisions. Part of that is because the president's calendar is supposed to be public. So we're all supposed to kind of see what the president is doing during the day. We are taxpayers. It is our country. His loyalty is, or her loyalty is supposed to be us. So it's part of that transparency. So he doesn't want to essentially alert people because if he canceled everything on his schedule, we as Americans would have some questions about what in the world is happening. Okay? So they're all going to meet. The other thing I'm going to mention is as the president is trying to make sure we don't all blow up or that we're in a nuclear war, he has a lot of health problems. And I'm going to read you all of the things that he's on at this moment, all of the drugs essentially he's on as he's trying to help make sure that we don't blow up. So he's on painkillers, stimulants, sleeping pills, hormones, anti-anxiety medication, antispasm medication, antibiotics, hydrocortisone, salt tablets, and something else for his Addison's disease and his back problems. And so he has all of these things in his system. So I don't know about you, but I'm personally glad that there was this group of men that were helping Kennedy out at this moment. And the decision that they're going to come up with is that they are going to do what's called a blockade. So essentially block the Soviets or any more Soviet equipment or ships from coming to Cuba. And so I can show you on the map. So essentially, you're going to put U.S. ships or U.S. things here so that the Soviets can't bring anything else to Cuba. Going too far. All right. One of the other things I forgot to mention is you would think that everybody in the Kennedy administration is on Kennedy's side. But what you actually see is that the Pentagon or the defense element of the administration or the country at that time, the military, are not necessarily on Kennedy's side. They are very much hardliners, very much interested in going to war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy's not actually getting the best advice from them. So he really needs to think about all the things that people are saying and think about, is this truly in the best interest of the United States, or is there something else going on, and make the best decision. So again, they're going to decide on that blockade. Technically, that blockade is an act of war. What it's not as aggressive as physically attacking the Soviet Union or Cuba. And so it's seen as kind of the best option. We'll also send 100,000 troops to Georgia, which again is going to be close to Cuba. So preparing for whatever this might look like. And then finally, he lets the American people know that they are in this dire time, this very, very scary moment. And if we think back to maybe my first lecture, my second lecture, where we were talking about John Green and Crash Course, and that he was saying that for Americans of this time, the question is, when will I blow up? And this is the closest that they've ever gotten to an answer to that question of like, this is when they might blow up, particularly if you're on the East Coast, you're within range of that missile. So from that, so we have a blockade, and we know that there's a Soviet ships that are headed toward Cuba. And at the last minute, they're going to turn around. The other thing is the Kennedy administration is going to get 2 letters from Khrushchev. And I have that in quotes because they are trying to figure out if Khrushchev actually wrote these. So are these authentic and are they serious? Does Khrushchev really mean what he says in these letters? And this first one is sort of a distraught, emotional letter. And Khrushchev, or what they perceive to be Khrushchev, essentially says, we'll remove our missiles if you please don't invade Cuba. Like, let's back off. Essentially, we can do this. We'll back off. And so Kennedy and his team are trying to figure out, okay, is this legit? Is this real? Should we listen to this? And they get a second letter. And the second letter is very much, you must remove your missiles in Turkey or else. So much more hard, aggressive stance. And so they have to decide which of these letters do they listen to? What's going on? And kind of their best understanding is that the first one probably was Khrushchev. And the second one are other people within the Communist Party or in the Soviet regime, essentially. And so what they decide to do is to just ignore the second letter. They just ignore it, and they just go with the first one, which I think is pretty crazy, because if you can imagine you're in a fight with your significant other or somebody, and you get like the sweet message after you've been in a fight, and you're like, okay, let's work this out. And you're going to be like, okay, yeah, let's work this out. And then you get this letter that's like, F you, I hate you, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that I am a good enough person where I could just ignore the second text or whatever it is. I would very much be like, all right, let's go. But the Kennedy administration manages not to essentially take the bait. All right. The other reason that this is even closer to a nuclear war than even we realize at that moment is that there is a Soviet submarine in the water, so in the Atlantic, and it is essentially breaking. There's something wrong with it. So it's overheating, and there are some other communication problems on board. And so the members of that crew have to decide. And the way it works in the Soviet Union is there's a nuclear submarine or a nuclear weapon on there. And so you have to have 3 people who all agree to release that nuclear weapon. So 2 of them are going to agree. The United States have been dropping depth charges, and they're trying to figure out, is that an attack on this submarine? Has the war started? What's going on? We don't have communication with the Soviet Union. We don't know what's happening. And this man right here, I'm not going to try and say his name because I will butcher it, but he ultimately is going to veto the use of a nuclear weapon. So even though 2 of his men on board say, yes, let's use it, we're being attacked, let's release this nuclear weapon, he thinks that that's not what's happening. And so he ultimately will veto the use of it and prevent that nuclear weapon from being released, which I think we all owe him a little bit of thanks because if we're all here essentially because we did not go into a nuclear war. So I appreciate this man very much. All right, so what's the aftermath of this crisis? Number 1, nobody actually wants nuclear war. So they're trying to figure out how we essentially backpedal from this. And so you're going to see that the 2 countries are going to put a hotline in between their leaders. So essentially a red telephone in the president's office and then one in the Soviet leader's office. There's also going to be a test ban treaty. So they're going to say, okay, we know we all have nuclear weapons, but we're not going to test them in the atmosphere or underwater. So a way of kind of trying to reduce the arms race or the height of the arms race. However, many Cuban Americans are pretty upset. The United States never actually removes Castro from power. And they essentially blame the Democrat in office. So they blame Kennedy. Many of them will actually still vote Republican to this day because of that. Under Obama, we actually see that policy is going to start to change, relax a lot of the restrictions, and try and open up diplomatic relationships with Cuba. Now, under the Trump administration, we've seen that change. And so we kind of reverted back to our old ways. And Cuba's an interesting place. It's kind of like a time capsule. And so they have not had a lot of outside communication or exchange of ideas. And so it still looks very much like the 1950s or did. And so I've always really wanted to go. It's the closest I'll ever get to a time machine and being able to see what it looked like in the 1950s. But I really like this political cartoon because it kind of gets at sort of this argument about America's policies. And so you can see the U.S. is essentially chasing Cuba. It's supposed to be an old Fidel Castro. And you can see Obama, and he's asking to change this policy. And the police officer, you think about Cold War warrior, whatever you want to call him. And he says, what? Give up the chase? Just when I was gaining on him. And you can see that these vehicles have not moved in quite a while. So this question is really saying that perhaps this old way of doing things, this 50-year-old policy is not working. We should try something else. If you're interested in kind of that opinion or what that might look like, there's this article right here that you can check out. All right. Let's see. Okay, so the other thing I will point out is these questions about Cuba, even though we're talking about events that happened quite a long time ago, they are still things that are playing out right now. We saw this even in the 2020 election. And so I'm going to play you this little clip about Bernie Sanders and Cuba. And as you're watching this clip, I just want you to remember that our list of human rights has over 30 rights on them. We, as the United States, do not protect all of them. Communist nations, whether you're talking about in the height of the Cold War or you're talking about Cuba, who's still considered a communist nation, don't protect them all. They focus on certain ones. So I want you to kind of think about that. And also, I want you to think about, like, what are the consequences of us still replaying the arguments of the Cold War? Like, what does it mean that we're still using kind of this language or these ideas? And so, go ahead and bring this up for you.
News for Bernie Sanders. We are seeing a ton of criticism of Bernie Sanders coming from an interview that he did with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes. And there, we saw them play a clip of an interview Sanders gave in the 80s where he said that the Cuban people didn't rise up against Fidel Castro because of education and healthcare. And regarding that clip, we saw Sanders say,
you know, when Fidel Castro came into office, you know what he did? He had a massive literacy program. Is that a bad thing? Even though Fidel Castro did it?
There's a lot of dissidents imprisoned in Cuba.
That's right. And we condemn that. Unlike Donald Trump, let's be clear. I do not think that Kim Jong-un is a good friend. I don't trade love letters with a murdering dictator. Vladimir Putin, not a great friend of mine.
Right, and so after that, you saw a lot of people going after Bernie. A number of people pointing out that Castro killed and jailed dissidents, others pointing out the other horrible things that he did to his people. And understand, we saw criticisms from both sides here. You had conservatives like Senator Marco Rubio tweeting, likely Dem nominee praised the supposed achievements of the Castro regime, and he's wrong about why people didn't overthrow Castro. It's not because he educated their kids, gave them health care. It's because his opponents were jailed, murdered, or exiled. You also had Democratic Representative Donna Shalala of Florida tweeting, I'm hoping that in the future, Senator Sanders will take time to speak to some of my constituents before he decides to sing the praises of a murderous tyrant like Fidel Castro. Though we also saw people defending Bernie Sanders, with tweets like, what Bernie did is point out to us that despite how bad Cuba was, there were positive elements that we could learn from. And with that, sharing a clip of then President Obama speaking at the Young Leaders of the Americas Initiative town hall, where he said,
and I said this to President Castro in Cuba. I said, look, you've made great progress in educating young people. Every child in Cuba gets a basic education. That's a huge improvement from where it was. Medical care. You know, the life expectancy of Cubans is equivalent to the United States, despite it being a very poor country, because they have access to healthcare. That's a huge achievement. They should be congratulated. But you drive around Havana and this economy is not working. And so you have to be practical in asking yourself, how can you achieve the goals of equality and inclusion?
And what I will say is it'll be interesting to see if this affects Sanders. Not only because, one, opponents of Sanders are trying to connect him to communism nationally, but also because, two, Florida is one of the most important swing states in the country. And Florida has a huge Cuban population, actually the highest Cuban population in the entire United States. And unsurprisingly, a large number of Cuban Americans not a fan of the Castros. Right? So the question becomes, will we see a notable drop in Sanders support in this very important swing state? For now, we'll look to the polls, but ultimately we won't know until March 17th. But with that said, I'd love...
All right, so obviously by now we know that... Hold on one second. We know that Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the race. But it's a really interesting one about using sort of these old ideas or this old fight to have an effect on our election today. Sorry, hold on one second, guys. There we go. Okay. The other thing is, I think you see some, I would argue, mistakes on both parts. I don't know if Bernie Sanders always does a great job of conveying for the horrors of a Castro administration who really was killing or exiling or repressing lots of people's rights. But on the other hand, we need to recognize that Cuba was able to do something that we as a country have not. And when it comes to human rights, Cuba has a much better record on healthcare, particularly on cancer research and helping people fight cancer, and on education. And so you can point those things out and also talk about how horrible other elements of human rights are under Cuba and under Castro. In the same way, in the United States, you can talk about we have a lot more freedoms that places like a Cuba or Russia doesn't have, but there are rights that we absolutely do not protect for all Americans, or we should be critical of how little we do. And so we want to make sure that we're having a balanced conversation about those things and being truthful about what's happening. And you can have both. You can have a really good record on part and a horrific record on other parts. And so making sure we're doing that. All right, so I'm going to just wrap up this little bit of Kennedy's foreign policy, and then I'll go over his assassination, and then we'll get into Vietnam in our next lecture. All right, so besides dealing with all of the, fun Cuba stuff, all of the we might blow up today stuff, Kennedy has some other ideas. And so he's got the Peace Corps, which is essentially you're going to send young, bright Americans out in the world to do foreign policy, or what's considered soft policy or a soft power. And so they might go and work on healthcare in Ghana, or they might go to a really rural area of China and work on something. It's a pretty successful part of Kennedy's foreign policy. It might be something that you guys are thinking about doing after you graduate from college. He also has what's known as the Alliance for Peace. It's essentially supposed to help Latin America, not very successful. And then I would argue one of the important parts of his foreign policy, though, is known as flexible response. So essentially, we talked about under the Eisenhower era that there was a lot of emphasis on the Air Force, because essentially a nuclear war, you're going to use nuclear weapons, and so you need to be able to transport those. But Kennedy is saying, we don't know what a war will look like, what the next war will look like, so we need to be able to be flexible to not only fight a nuclear war, but also a conventional war. When it comes to Kennedy's domestic policy, we'll kind of talk about the new frontier in the next unit, but we're going to see him really dedicate energy to NASA. He is going to be the man that says by the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon. He's going to put a lot of money and resources into NASA. And essentially, this is going to be how we defeat the Soviet Union in space. And while Kennedy dies, so he doesn't get to see it, what we will see is that we do put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. So we do live up to those things that he's calling for. All right, so then Kennedy's going to get assassinated, which we'll talk about in just a second, and LBJ is going to take over. I don't really need you to know all of these things under here for this term, or think about all of these things, but I'll just point out two of these, essentially, or three of these. Number one, Johnson Doctrine. So whereas Truman's doctrine, you're going to give people money or resources to fight communism, Johnson's essentially going to say, we can do this in Latin America. You might also think about it as the Eisenhower doctrine said we would get involved in the Middle East to stop the spread or the aggression of communism. This is similar, except this is going to be in Latin America. So they're kind of picking a location that they're going to fight communism in. Okay? The last two things I'll point out here is, you can't see where I'm pointing. The U.S. and the Soviet Union are going to agree to no weapons in outer space. We're not going to extend the Cold War to the outer space world. Reagan will have some different ideas about that, but we'll get there. Our current administration has ideas about that too. And then the last thing I'll say is just the Engel v. Vitale SCOTUS case, the very last thing that is highlighted right here. And the reason that I point that out at this moment is this says that you cannot be forced to pray in school. And that doesn't mean like you as an individual can do your own thing, but you can't have it be a school-sanctioned event or a class-sanctioned event or anything like that where people are praying. And that is essentially because the Supreme Court says that that's a violation of our First Amendment rights, so freedom of religion. A school to have separation between church and state. And so the school cannot sanction or enforce you to do a religious activity or assume that you believe in a singular God or anything like that, or would pray to a singular God. And I point this out in the Cold War unit is because in the beginning, when we were talking about McCarthyism or the early fights against communism, there was a very strong emphasis on that communists were atheists. Oh my gosh, we as a Christian nation must fight back against these atheists. But now, when we're in the 60s, we're seeing that there is, I would argue, a better understanding or a better emphasis to protect people's actual religious freedom, whatever that looks like, and to make sure that that's a divide and protecting people's individual rights. And not kind of giving into the fear mongering that we saw in the McCarthy era, even when it comes to domestic issues. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. And tomorrow, or whenever you watch your next lecture, we will dig into Vietnam. All right, bye.